By watching this short video, you will learn what an array is, what a loop is, and how to use a loop to traverse an array. So an array is a collection of like objects, and here we have a graphical representation of kind of what an array is. It's just basically we have three students, I suppose. Her name is Alice, and his name is Bob, and his name is Charlie. And so we have three students here that are indexed at 0, 1, and 2. So essentially the value is what you actually want to insert in the array. It's what you want to store. It's the data you're interested in. And the index is where to find it. Just like in a book. In a book, if you need to figure out where to find something, you immediately go to the back of the book and look at the index to see what page to turn to. This is why we actually call it an index when we talk about arrays. So, extending that metaphor, Bob is on page 1. The important thing to notice here, and this is the source of many a confusion and beginning programmer bug, is that arrays start at 0. They do not start at 1. By default, all arrays start at 0. This is an important point to keep in mind. So let's go ahead and code it up and see how to create an array and how to work with the array using loops. So we've got a little PHP Storm project going. And here's how to create the array. We simply use the built-in array function. That's all there is to it. And I can list as many students as I want in this array. Now here, the data type is a type string. Of course, in an array, you can have any data type you can imagine, a string, an integer, booleans, objects, anything you like. Again, go back to the fundamental definition of an array. It's a collection of related like objects. So now we've created the array, but we haven't done anything with it. It's not too exciting. We could always just say something like this. The first student is, and notice I put a 0 there for the first student. This is another important point. When I use the cardinal numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm referring to a specific index in the array. And when I use the ordinal numbers, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, I'm actually referring to the first index that I see, the second index that I see, the third index that I see. Now by default, remember, all arrays count up from 0, right? So the first index that I see is actually 0. So that's a very important point. If I am using the cardinal numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, it's an index. If I'm using the ordinal numbers, first, second, third, fourth, it's which index am I looking at? The first index, the second index, the third index. Okay, let's go ahead and save this and see what it looks like on screen. It says the first student is Alice. Yay! That is true. She is the student at array index 0, and she is the first student. Okay, I'm going to go ahead back out of this, so I'll delete it. And now we're going to use a for loop to traverse the array. Now, the for loop consists of 3 components. By the way, notice that I immediately started my braces here. This is a really good habit to get into because it'll prevent a lot of syntax errors down the line. Anyway, back to what a for loop is. So a for loop is just basically a defined way of repeating something multiple times. And it starts out at a start condition our start condition is going to be for I is assigned to 0. So the start condition tells us where to start. Lo and behold, here I've decided to start at the beginning. Isn't that amusing? And I is assigned to 0 defines the beginning, because what is the first index that we just discussed? Well, the first index is 0, so I'm going to start at 0. The next part is the ending condition. The for loop will go until it is stopped by the ending condition. So we're going to take our little variable I and set it less than the count of the array. Now the count of the array actually is a PHP system function that returns how many elements are in the array. This way you don't have to manually count up, oh, how many students we put in there? 1, 2, 3? I think it was 3. Yeah, probably 3. No, you don't have to do that. Just use the count function in PHP. It'll do the hard work for you. Yeah, this is especially useful for when you get unpredictable array sizes and or very large arrays. Now, the third and final component to the for loop is what to do at each step. Should I go from 0 to 1? Should I go from 0 to 2? Should I add 5? Should I subtract 3? When I traverse the array, what should I do at each step? Well, the simplest thing to say is to say, well, let's count from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, blah, blah, blah. So the shorthand way of saying that is to say I plus plus. Mathematically, I plus plus is pretty much the same thing as take I and add 1 to it, so a lot of people would say that I plus plus is the equivalent to I is assigned to I plus 1. I'll put that in a comment right here. Is that true? I plus plus is the same as I is assigned to I plus 1. No. I plus plus is more efficient, yet yields the same answer. So if you only have to count up by 1, definitely use I plus plus. It is actually more efficient than manually doing the mathematics there. Yet you get the same answer. Okay, back to it. Okay, now what we're going to do is use the for loop to go ahead and display all the values in the array. Okay, so within the for loop, we're echoing out for loop, and this is going to differentiate from the for each loop that we're about to learn about. Student I is, need a space there, students I. Now, the important part of the syntax here is that we have the open box and the close box to note which index on the array we're using. And which index are we using? Well, we're using I. I is what we set up here in the preamble of the for loop. Let's see this at work. Here we go. For loop, student 0 is Alice, student 1 is Bob, student 2 is Charlie. Makes sense. As you can see, we have the indexes kind of going down here, and then we have the values right here. So that's one very good way to traverse an array, is to use a for loop. The problem with the for loop, I suppose, is that we have to manually set up this every time. You could, of course, repetitively do that for every array you encounter. It becomes kind of boilerplate and becomes kind of redundant and boring. So we're going to use something a little more fun. We're going to actually now use something called for each. For each is actually PHP's kind of little shortcut to what we just did with this for loop, and is specifically customized for using a loop to traverse an array. And we can use a few shortcuts here. It's actually pretty cool. So, for each, like the for loop, has several components to it. The keyword for each, and then the first thing you put is what you want to traverse, in this case, students. So that's your array. The second thing you have to put is the actual keyword as. So we're just going to type as. The next thing you have to do is just do I lambda and then a value. So this is actually going to pretty much create the same construction that we had in the for loop, but it's just constructed a little differently. So we have the for each, first of all. The for each keywords signals a for each loop. The students is the array we're going to be working with, which is the array we created over here. The keyword as is a separator for the next part. And here we have the index. And just like in the for each loop, in the for loop, I mean, we're going to use the I in the for each loop just for consistency. Then we have this little operator. It's actually called lambda, but there's really no useful name for it. And then we have this. Now this is something that you will not see in the for loop. There's no equivalent up here, so don't look for it. What this is PHP has kind of shortcutted for us the creation of a little variable for the value. And so this allows us to write simple code like this. Wow, look at how much simpler that is in the for each loop. And that's the power of the for each loop. Is for each loop, again, kind of a label to separate out where these are coming from. And then student, I is student. Wow. Where did this come from? Like I said, PHP does us the favor of creating this for us and creates a little variable with the value in it. Let's see how this looks when we run the code. Look at that. Exactly the same output. Student 0 is Alice, student 1 is Bob, and student 2 is Charlie. But simpler to write. That's the advantage of the for each loop. So, by watching this short video, you've learned what an array is, how looping works, and how to use a for and a for each loop to traverse an array.